one of your hot takes here. You said product managers are too utopian.
Okay, well, to be clear, I don't think every product manager is too utopian, but it's a tendency. That's a very different dynamic than what you're going to be as a product manager at Meta. People ask me, what's the number one thing you look for? And it is actually curiosity, 1,000,000%. It's a big accomplishment to build and launch this streaming service in the time frame that we did. We basically did it in 9 months, which I think is a record. Hey, this content asset really has 30 pieces of metadata. Now we apply that through the whole catalog, and now we can better cross-pollinate with vectors that one piece of content is similar to another piece of content. RFE, recency, frequency, and engagement. Recency is how recent that person has been here. Frequency, how often do they come? And engagement, that's how much they watch, how much time they spend.
Hey, this is Carlos's AI voice clone. He's the CEO of Product School and the host on the Product Podcast. Let me introduce today's guest first. Michael Cerda is the Chief Product and Technology Officer at TelevisaUnivision, the world's leading Spanish language media company, reaching 125 million Spanish speakers daily across the US and Latin America. 2 years ago, they launched VX, a consumer streaming platform competing with US-based giants like Netflix and Disney+. VIX has already surpassed 50 million global monthly active users, driven by the world's largest library of Spanish language content, including major soccer rights like the World Cup, European Championship, and Champions League. Michael's career is equally impressive. He launched Disney Plus as VP of Product at Disney, led Apple's first credit card as CPO at Goldman Sachs, and worked directly with Mark Zuckerberg at Meta. At VIX, Michael leads product management, design, and engineering. He leverages AI to enrich metadata, improve content recommendations, and solve the cold start problem, all while steering VIX toward profitability by late 2024. In this episode, we cover personalizing content for millions across 19 countries, using AI and large language models for metadata and UX, balancing traditional TV habits with modern streaming, scaling a streaming service in just 9 months, targeting personas with cultural insights. What stood out to me was Michael's approach to product management. He draws parallels between building products and his passions for music, yoga, and cooking. His emphasis on curiosity as the top trait for product managers brings a fresh perspective to talent acquisition in tech. Let's dive in. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you, Carlos. It's great to be here.
Michael, let's jump into it. I see that you were a yoga teacher and opened up a yoga school around 20 years ago.
Yeah, wow, it's been 20 years, but that is true. I opened up a yoga school called The Yoga Company. And it was interesting because in those days, yoga and business weren't cool to mix those two things. The idea behind the company was to make it about company as in people. That was what they call a double entendre, the use of the word company, right? But I tried to make it, like any product person doing a yoga thing would do, I tried to make it accessible to the audience. In those days in the East San Francisco Bay, yoga just wasn't accessible. It was always, you either got it in a gym, which usually wasn't great yoga or authentic, or you got it in a yoga studio that was in the back behind a building, up some stairs in a very quiet, dark space where everybody was like not saying hello, welcome, right? And everybody was meditating when you walk in. So nothing was inviting. So I tried to create something. I put a yoga school like in a shopping center. It was next to like an Albertsons shopping center across from a McDonald's, next to the CVS, right? You couldn't miss it. And, we brought yoga to about 5,000 new yoga students and exposed it to them. And I had a really good time doing that. I could only do it for a few years because I did it at the time that we referred to, for those of us that were around back then, as the nuclear winter in Silicon Valley. This was just after the dot-com bubble burst and sort of right after 9/11 in that time period. So it was something to do when nothing else was going on. It was about a passion project and trying to do something that felt good and was good for health and good for people and wellness. And I've been a practitioner ever since, although I don't have the school anymore. But yes, that was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
And I see the background, you have plenty of instruments there. So I'm very curious to know how you were able to connect your practices, your passions outside of work, also to the work that you do.
Yeah, so music I've been playing all my life. And I've only been a product guy for 25 years. But I realized that they're both one and the same. Being a yoga teacher was similar. I love to cook. That is very similar. It's all about what to build for who over what period of time. And you could map that across all of those areas, right? If you're a songwriter, it's like, what song are you writing? Who are you writing it for? And when do you want to release it? What does it mean to release it and give it a life of its own? It's just like a product release, right? You're very deterministic. You're very methodical, right? All of these things lend to each other. And so over the years, I've managed to do both and weave them in and out. And, I have a Latin jazz group called the Yellow House Orchestra. We've put many records out. You could see them out there on Spotify and over YouTube and things. But I also have a pop project called the Sunday Review, which is this is interesting as a product guy, and any of the product people listening, this is a total product guy's move on a band, right? So during the pandemic, the guy who's my designer right now, and he worked with me before, designer, his name is Chris Phillips. He's in New York. I'm just outside of San Francisco. So during the pandemic, we thought, hey, let's just write some songs together. And we started writing them, and this was the constraint we created, as if it was 1988 still, but we're the same people, but we knew now what we would know then, right? So we have the same level of music theory and understanding in 88 when we're in high school, at least he and I were. What would we have written together if we were in the band? And that's the whole project. So we're writing these songs, and they're deliberately with guilty pleasure, right? They're deliberately from those times. And what we get is something that's very much, Steely Dan-ish, Hall & Oates-ish, and everything in that ilk. But it's super fun because we can get away with it because it's deliberate. Once again, very deterministic, right? About the craft. And we just have a ball with it. And that band's based in New York City. So whenever I go through New York City, I play with that band.
And there's something about successful professionals and their level of curiosity. Like all these incredible product leaders that I know, they all have passions, and they find ways to find time for those passions because that's also part of their life. And then you end up ways to connect in those passions and in unexpected ways. But ultimately, I think having that inherent curiosity, it's very important.
When I look and evaluate product managers, whether I'm hiring some or whether I'm looking at my own team, people ask me, what's the number one thing you look for? And it is actually curiosity. 1,000,000%. Because if you're not curious, you're not necessarily realizing that you don't know what you don't know. And if you can accept that you don't know what you don't know, you can go hunting. You can go on a journey and you could find things. You could pour through your data, right? You could pour through your audience, right? We were just doing that very recently. We're just coming off of a project with where I work right now at TelevisaUnivision, where we're looking at our audience and we're like trying to determine with the data we have, who are the personas in that audience? If you know what a persona is among your audience, you can start to double down on their behaviors, their needs, their mindsets, and therefore you can build for them. And in our case, we're in 19 different countries. So it's a little wild because it's not all created equal. Our US market, because we do Spanish language video streaming, right? So in the US, there's a very different Hispanic audience than there is in, say, Colombia or in Mexico. Those are distinct audiences. So we have to be mindful of the regions and mindful of our content catalog as it relates to those regions. In the US, we have, for example, one of the personas that's very highly engaged. We call this person, and this is just working names, right? So don't take it too seriously, but straightforward Sophia. And Sophia is someone that she's a single mom and she wants things to just work. She doesn't want to spend time getting her TV dialed into the right input, right? It's just got to turn on and work. She doesn't have time to search for something. In her journey, she's got to find something quickly to put it on and have that entertainment start. And this is somebody that binges on our originals. We have a whole bunch of originals, but generally busy with work and family and really needs technology and any kind of subscription plans to be straightforward, right? That stuff just has to work. So when you think about, and by the way, straightforward Sophia, as we call her, is bilingual. She's in the US. She just as well watches things on other streaming services. It's just that she comes to us for specific things that resonate from the country that she comes from, right? Or the heritage that she has. So anyway, what I'm getting to is personas, and being persona aware is one of the critical aspects of the product journey, because you're digging into your audience, you're understanding, again, behaviors, needs, and mindsets. And only then can you know what to build for who over what period. So I might say in this next 3 months, I'm going to roll out a dozen features that are geared toward this persona, knowing very well that I'm going to leave another persona, let's call him Game Day Gary, who comes just to watch soccer, right? So we have a bunch of soccer. And Gary just comes to watch soccer. Then he leaves, comes back. And guess what? Gary doesn't even speak Spanish, probably. That's what we're learning, because we know that his keyboard is in English. So we have to think, again, very deterministically about what we built for a straightforward Sophia versus a Game Day Gary. A Game Day Gary, you might think as a product person, you might think, oh, gee, you might come up with a product SKU that's just sports based, or that's just seasonal. Or you might go out on a limb and say, let's target Game Day Gary with an annual plan. So that way he doesn't churn out in the off seasons. You see what I'm saying?
Totally. Well, let's start with just giving us an overview of your company, TelevisaUnivision. I know it's huge, and specifically what you do as a Chief Product and Technology Officer.
Yeah, so this company has been around for decades as two different companies. So Televisa in Mexico and Univision in the United States. So when I was like a little kid, right, I lived with my grandparents, and they had come from Mexico, from a place called Morelia in Michoacan, which I'm sure Laura knows. And my father was born in the United States, in California. And then I came along in the 70s. And, when my dad's era were born, what's interesting is they were trying to become more American, right? So there was going English first. They were leaning more into English. And so by the time I came around, everybody's speaking English, but my grandparents are still speaking Spanish, right? And everything they had on TV at the time was Spanish television, and a Spanish language television. And it was a network called SIN, Canal 34, Los Angeles. And I'll never forget that. And it was all the novelas. It was all the lucha libre, the wrestling, the early days of wrestling. I think I first saw like Andre the Giant there before I saw him on USA or whoever acquired it later, before the Ed McMahon era, I think. And I saw all this stuff. And it was a memory. And of course, my grandparents passed away, and so forth. And I'd been working on Disney Plus. I was the head of product for Disney Plus for a few years, and I was recruited into Univision just before they merged with Televisa. So Televisa, a bunch of big TV stations and studios in Mexico. Univision, a bunch of studios and TV stations in the U.S. One of them being SAEN. That became Univision. And so now the companies merged just after I joined, and merged to combine content catalogs and assets and audiences and markets, and form a bigger company and build a streaming service. Knowing that streaming is sort of the next inflection in consumer entertainment and consumption. We knew we needed to build something very compelling and very, very deliberate, targeted toward our market. And as people were cutting cords in linear, right, we're there with streaming. So my area is an area we called VIX, VIX. That's the name of the streaming service. And it's a free ad-supported service with a premium tier, right? So on the free service, which in the business we call AVOD, which is, video advertising, video on demand, although we have some live as well. So it's not really AVOD, it's AVOD plus. So on the VOD side, video on demand, we have 53,000 hours of content ranging from like novelas, original series, and a whole bunch of movies. We have some channels. And this is interesting from a product perspective too, because a lot of us as consumers tend to consume, I think, video on demand. That's what Netflix gives us, right? A video on demand interface. In the markets we're in, there's a lot of people that are cutting the cable cord and going right online and going to streaming. So we've built the interfaces that they're used to seeing in TV, which in the business we call the EPG, electronic programming grid. It's an old school term, but think about the last time you turned on the TV guide, right? And you saw the grid of channels. You saw channel 2, 3, 4, and you saw the shows right across the rows. So we have a channels interface, an EPG interface, where we have 84 in the US and 71, I think, now in Mexico. And it's all the same content, just the discovery mechanism is different. And the interface is like you're flipping through the channels and just putting on what you put on, versus in the VOD environment, you're like, oh, I want to go to this series in this episode, right? Those are two different journeys, and we get two different value propositions out there, and we can let our audience decide. We do have 24/7 news. We do have a whole bunch of sports, a bunch of soccer primarily, Liga MX in Mexico, Champions League, UEFA, a whole bunch of soccer. So we end up in the US getting a lot of soccer fans agnostic of the language, which is interesting. But of course in Mexico, we're kind of the home of soccer. That's the AVOD side. We also have a premium service, which in the US is $6.99 per month. And in the premium service, it's a whole bunch of originals. It's new. Think about the idea. We've all become accustomed to the Netflix original, right? Or even the Apple TV Plus original, etc. When I was at Disney, we had originals. We also have originals. And when we started VIX, we actually hired a lot of the people that had been working on the Netflix, originals for Spanish language. They were the first sort of content team here. And so there's a whole bunch of series that we've got that if you're the Netflix type of viewer, these would resonate with you. We launched some of these. Some of them resonated. Some of them didn't, right? This is how you find, like in any product market fit. And ours is not only with the interfaces, like I was getting at with VOD versus channels based, but also with the content. And what we're I think realizing is that a lot of the content that resonates most is the content that's closest to home, right? It's the content that you're not finding elsewhere. In our case, we have some originals around, Maria Felix. We have El Mujer del Diablo. We have El Show, which is all about the show that was on in the 80s called Paco Stanley. It was a variety show, and we have a whole docu-series around how that happened and how he was assassinated and all this crazy stuff, right? So all that stuff resonates. And of course, the novelas is the lion's share. That's the highest watched, type of content. So what we're doing is we're bringing this value proposition uniquely, I think, to our audience. And this is content that they're not necessarily finding in other places. And it's very intentional, and it's very, very close to home to the audience.
Yeah, and I think for some of the people who might be listening, they don't speak Spanish. They might not have an idea of how big of a deal this is. Like the last statistic that I saw from your product was that there are over 125 million Spanish speakers connecting to your product every day from the US and Latin America.
Yeah, it's big. It's big. And of course, when I was at Disney, when I left, we were at about 100 million paying subscribers. That was ginormous. This is, and when as a product person, because I know this is a product-based podcast, you like to think of what you do as impactful, right? That's how I make my sort of career choices. I think about what is my impact ability over time with a given opportunity. At Disney, we got to 100 million paying subscribers. I thought, okay, that was phenomenal. What's next? And I just happened to be recruited into this opportunity here. And I thought, wow, to bring this to the audience in my heritage. If my grandparents were still alive and still watching this stuff, they would get a kick out of this. I got to believe somewhere in heaven they're proud, right? So I have some purpose here. And I think that we have that many people viewing on a regular basis. We've hit the note, right? We've hit the high notes that matter. And we've even, by the way, we've brought some older stuff back into the catalog, like Chavo del Ocho is a big popular series. A whole bunch of stuff has come through that is, for the older generations, it's nostalgia. For the not so older, it's seeing something new but familiar. For families, it's something that an extended family can watch together, right? And we as we look at our personas that I mentioned earlier, we start looking about what's the journey like in the day in the life of a given persona. Sometimes those are extended households, right? And you've got the whole house gathering to watch something on Sunday night. And that's the way I remembered it as a kid too.
Yeah, so I want to dig deeper into that. You talked about two different personas: the work, the mom that has no time to do other than work, and you have the soccer fan. But like, if you are talking about a big audience of hundreds of millions of users, like, how do you go about segmenting it, even at a one-on-one level? So when they log in into your platform, they can find content that they are going to resonate with.
It's an excellent question. And the way we're looking at it is the way we've gotten to our personas, by the way, to begin with, and we're still pressure testing this. It's still new. We're inferring this through data, through their viewing history. We have a thing called in the US, on the US audience, we have a household graph where we know a lot about a household based on a whole bunch of data points that we've built out. And we're inferring a lot of this, and we're clustering, and we're combining, and we're making some assumptions as well, by the way. So anytime you do personas, you usually start with the data, and then you go to qualitative research after that to really validate. We're kind of in that phase now. To your question, though, how do you target these personas as they come into the platform, right? And that's one place, that's probably our biggest lever of opportunity as I look at 2025, is personalizing this. We all know as consumers that use services like Netflix that it's ultra personalized, right? Your interface is going to be different than mine, different than Laura's, etc. And that's great because it's very targeted. The service has gotten to know us. They've gone through great lengths to get that really tuned. If you think about the last time you were looking for something to watch on a service like Netflix, and you think about the time it took you to find something to watch, it probably isn't that much time. And we think about those things because the problem is if people take up too much time looking for something to watch, they don't make any choice and they move on. It's sort of that plethora of choice problem. When you give people too many options, they don't make any and they bounce, right? So in our case, one of our challenges is the cold start challenge. Right now, up until now, and keep in mind, we've only been up and running for just over 2 years. So we're still a pretty nascent service, even though there's a lot of impact in the audience already. It's still early days. And Netflix been around a long time. Their algorithms, they were working on all of that stuff well before the Gen AI, chapter started. But given all of that, what we're doing is we're trying to sort of get there faster and sort of accelerate our steps toward that vision of giving people even the best cold start experience. For example, if you saw an ad on Facebook for a certain original that we had out there, that should tell us something that you're coming from that ad, and we should deliver on that once you get into this. There should be sort of a deferred deep link experience that gets you there. And I think as we look at 25 in trying to really super personalize the experience, we have to build those experiences out. So what we're doing, I mentioned the channel grid earlier, right? The old TV guide. So a lot of the content when it was originally made for TV, think about a novella. Okay. And a novella, it has, a synopsis. What's it about? It's got the actors. It's got the year. Maybe there's a rating for TV now, right? It's got various pieces of what we'll call metadata. The truth is that's all you needed for TV. But for streaming, you need much more nuanced and broad metadata. So what we've done recently is we've taken all of our content, run it through the large language models to enrich in the metadata. So we've taken that metadata specifically. So not only in the streaming version of this metadata that we're enriching, not only are we getting more of it, but we're getting more refined. So for example, instead of just the title, the synopsis, the actors, etc., you're getting other things like warm summer day, oops, I didn't mean to put the thumb up there. Warm summer day. We're talking things like, is it action? Is there violence? Is there gunshots? Is there romance? Is there a fast car chase? Right? Were there sharks in the ocean? Right? I'm making all this up, but if you can aggregate all of this and sort of extrapolate to, hey, this content asset really has 30 pieces of metadata. Now we apply that through the whole catalog, and now we can better cross-pollinate with vectors that one piece of content is similar to another piece of content. Therefore, we get much, much better about what we can recommend for you. So what we have right now in our system is a recommended for you row. Netflix today, the entire experience is kind of recommended for you. We have a row, but our next step in 2025 is to personalize the entire experience so that it's, we know where you came from, why you're here. If we know you're game day Gary and here just for the soccer, we should give you just a straight up soccer interface, right? We shouldn't get in the way of that. And that's what we're striving to do as we go forward to 2025. I give you all this because I think, from a product perspective, it's so interesting. And I was talking to my team recently about this. It's a big accomplishment, I think, to build and launch this streaming service in the time frame that we did. We basically did it in 9 months, which I think is a record. I think it might be a record. We did it in 9 months to launch the AVOD service. 3 months later, we launched the SVOD service. So there was a certain amount of muscle memory we had to build up to do that quickly. And by the way, all these people didn't work here yet. This is another interesting part of the journey. There was some Univision people, some Televisa people. There was the original VIX, which was an older smaller video service. There was a handful of people from there. Then I hired the rest. I hired like 300 people, like in the course of 90 days. I just called everybody I knew that knew something about video and brought them here. Whether it was friends from Disney, friends I worked with on video at Facebook. I built out Vivo years ago, the music video service. So people from there came and joined. And we all joined forces and we marched at this. My point about saying all that isn't to brag that, we did it in such a short amount of time, although I think that's pretty cool. It's that our job as product people is even more challenged and more refined as we go into this next chapter. Because before, you're building all the basic things, the feature sets that every video streaming service has, right? When you build a new streaming service, you don't want to build it too dissimilar than anything else because there's conventions people are used to as consumers. They know what interfaces look like. When you launch the streaming service, there's that thing at the very top that rotates. It's the hero where people put the most important stuff of the day. Then there's like all these rows that are sorted in some way, right? That there's search, that there's identity, that there's recommendations, that there's profiles, that there's mobile downloads on the mobile side, that there's all these features, right? We've been swinging at this parity stuff. And I'll give you another example. Like, you got to build features so that when people feel like they want to cancel, you got to make it so that they can cancel without too difficult a time. But you want to be able to remind them on the way, are you sure you want to cancel? So you start building cancel save tactics, like you start showing images of the things that they watched and that they liked. Like, are you sure you want to leave this? But you don't want to get in the way with it, obviously, but you want to be conscious about those things. So we built a lot of those things. We launched a lot of partnerships, whereby, for example, Easy in Mexico, it's a big cable company. If you're an Easy subscriber, you have access to VIX for a period of time, complimentary, right? And I think that's great because it helps people live in both sides of the world, the cable world and the streaming world at the same time, wherever they'd like to live. But anyway, coming back to my primary point here, though, our job as product people actually gets harder. That was just execution. That was raw, grinded out execution that we just did the last few years. Now we're turning the page into a new inflection of being much more heady, much more data driven, much more refined, much smarter about what we build for who over what period of time.
So as you try to refine your product, what are some of those leading indicators that you are using to measure success? An example you gave before is maybe the time that it takes for a user to find something that they want to watch. What else is there that leads to success for you?
Yeah, we look at one of our North Star KPIs is what we call total streaming hours. So internally, we refer to that as TSH for short. And the TSH is a primary KPI because it stretches over both parts of our business, our AVOD and our SVOD subscription side as well. So total streaming hours is one. For the ad business, that's important because the more hours streamed, the more ad inventory there is, right? And the more your ad sales force can go out and sell ads. On the SVOD side, we look at, new subscriber growth. We look at churn, right? So when a given product manager, puts a feature on the table for us to consider doing, what happens is it goes through that scrutiny. Their job is to write a product brief. And in that product brief, they have to be very, very clear up front about what it is they're trying to build. Again, for which audience and to what end, what is the outcome? So I design my teams to build toward the outcome. So I split my product management team, for example, between growth and engagement. So on the growth side, it's all about getting subscribers in or just going all out and driving total streaming hours. The engagement side is more about like, okay, now that we've got this subscriber or this viewer, how do we keep them? So this person starts to think about, and this is as we go into 2025 now, it's not just about building a better search feature. It's about building features that get people. For example, there's a framework we use, and I call this, and I'm sure other product people have similar frameworks. RFE, recency, frequency, and engagement. Recency is how recent that person has been here. Frequency, how often do they come? And engagement, that's how much they watch, how much time they spend. And what you find is you end up with levers that you can pull as you think about the world that way, right? And for example, if you wanted to drive frequency, getting people to come back more often, you start to think about strategies to do that. In our case, we're building things like the follow model so that you can follow teams, actors, shows. Certainly we infer that, but when people make those deterministic decisions, that's even stronger signal. And we can, in those flows, encourage them to opt in for push notifications, right? A lot of times people don't want to be push notified because it's too noisy. But if we can tighten the signal, right, and give you the notifications on just the soccer that you care about, or just the season 2 of that original series that you fell in love with, right, this past year, that's more signal, and we're going to bring you back in. So you start to think about strategies around that. We're starting to look at, the notion of short form. Like, what does short form mean? What if, what can we do if we had a great soccer tournament? There's a lot of great assets like highlights, right? We all, if you're a sports fan, you love highlights. You watch them almost every day, probably. Why not have a surface for that? So we're contemplating on the mobile interface, at least, or the mobile surface, having those kinds of interfaces. So we think a lot about interfaces. We think about, and this is where all of the personalization comes into play, right? If we know we want to drive more engagement with you, in the RFE framework, we're thinking about the E here. We might try freshening up our interface because you might be tired of coming and seeing the same old thing. We might try, and you've seen Netflix be masterful with this, by using alternative key art on the content tiles, right? Sometimes you'll see the same thing as you've seen before, but with a different piece of art that might be more enticing to you, right? We want to get smarter about all those things. So subscription growth, total streaming hours, churn mitigation, all those things, and the levers being the RFE levers, those are very, very smart places for us to play in.
I want to talk more about pricing because you mentioned that your ad tier is free, which is relatively unique compared to the ad-supported tiers with Netflix or Disney Plus. They still charge less so than an ad-free tier, but they still charge. So what's your rationale behind offering a fully free tier?
What we've come to know about our audience is there's there's a cohort, there's a segment that probably will never buy. They will never subscribe, right? There's there's an economic, impact here. And if you spend time in parts of like Mexico or Latin America, and I always pressure test this when I go to Mexico, and I talk to people about it just to see, have they heard of VIX? And sometimes what I find out is, there's people that share their internet service with other people on the block, and they kind of go in on one account, right? And so, there's we just have to be mindful that there's audiences that may never pay because it may never make sense, right? That's just not clearly an option. There's other audiences that actually will pay, but they won't pay with a credit card because most of their bills they pay for with that week's cash, right? So there's a convenience store in Mexico called Oxxo. It's sort of like analogous in the US to like a 7-Eleven sort of a store. People go in there, maybe pay their cell phone bill, buy some stuff for the weekend, and they can buy VIX now, and they go home and activate it on their device, and it runs out, and then they go back to top up later whenever they're ready to do that, right? So we have to be much more mindful about our addressable market, and as we've come to know our market, we've come to know that there's a certain segment that will likely never upgrade. And we're cool with that. That is why we have a pure AVOD service, is to cater to that. And so that doesn't mean that we'll never have one of those combined services that's, premium with ads. We're contemplating that just like everybody else. It's becoming a normal thing. But you have to be mindful as well not to confuse the marketplace. So I'll give you a good example of this. When we first launched VIX, it was in March of 22, the AVOD service. We launched it. It was off to the races. A bunch of people jumped on, started watching. And then 3 months later, we launched a subscription tier. At the time, we called it VIX Plus. So we had VIX and VIX Plus. And we kind of had two different marketing campaigns. You had the one campaigns going out to acquire AVOD viewers, and you had another campaign going out acquiring SVOD viewers with the more premium content and the premium soccer games and blah, blah, blah. And what we learned the hard way a few months in is we confused that AVOD audience. A lot of them assumed that thing they started falling in love with just a few months ago, they're charging for that now. Right? So we created for ourselves a bunch of confusion in the marketplace. So that led us down a road of like saying, okay, let's take a step back. We're trying to be all things to all audiences to find our market fit and see what our opportunity is here. We think we know what it looks like, but we're learning nuanced aspects of it. So let's take a step back. And what we decided to do, and this is our head of marketing, also from Spain, Roger Soler, he came up with this thing that he called the one brand strategy that we put in play, which is the one brand strategy, which is, okay, we're just going to market as VIX now. That's all we're going to talk about. We're not going to do the VIX and VIX Plus. We're going to be very straightforward. We're going to acquire people into the AVOD tier. There'll be some campaigns on the SVOD tier, but the difference is we're thinking about it as a tier rather than a different thing. So with this mindset, you go and you create this funnel. You bring people into the AVOD service. Some percentage of them you're going to convert into SVOD subscriber, right? And that helps your cost of customer acquisition because you're mining among your own audience. And if they do churn, they're only going back to the AVOD service, right? So you're not losing them forever. So that's kind of some of maybe some of the madness, the rhyme to the reason here. And I think, that has served us well. So at this point in time, we have VIX and we have VIX Premium inside. But see, here's the thing. Now that we're getting smarter about our personas and we're starting to know and recognize the patterns and the propensities of the people that are not likely to subscribe, what we can do is we can ratchet down all the life cycle comms that we head their way with, right? we could give them, we could do more to drive them back into the service from a frequency standpoint, right? Rather than trying to upgrade them all the time. Because I'm sure their experience is coming into the service. We're going to use a tool like Braze to do an in-app alert and block them, right? They're trying to watch something. We got this thing they got to cancel out of. We're trying to pitch them on this upgrade to this VIX premium. Let's stop doing that, right? Let's not do that to them. Let's make them happier. Let's increase the LTV for them as AVOD viewers and be happy with that, and let them be happy with that, and focus on other personas with the heavy life cycle upgrade mechanism. See what I mean?
Totally. Sounds like the Spotify or YouTube pricing model, where they still offer a forever free tier where they monetize through ads, while offering some premium tiers for people that do not want to have ads, right? Which is different than maybe how Netflix or Disney Plus or the streaming service are monetizing today. And I want to ask you about the competitive landscape, because it seems like you are competing for attention. And some of that attention can be spent on media and entertainment streaming services, but it can also be spent on social media, music platforms. Or how are you thinking about the competitive landscape and how you're trying to get a bigger share of that?
It's really YouTube more than anything for us, is what we see as our, and even back when I was at Facebook, I was thinking in time spent terms, right? So I've been doing that for a while, and thinking about what does it mean and what does it look like to drive time spent, and what kinds of things do you do to enrich in that, to make it worth somebody spending more time. And I apply some of the frameworks that I used way back when I was putting the news in the news feed at Facebook, and that's a for better or worse thing, because there was draft on impact from that. But I try to think about what are the things that are going to bring people uniquely here. And what happens is, we all know in YouTube, it's the wide world of everything. Everything is there. But what you don't have there is a 27-minute novella per se. In some cases you do, but not commonly. What we'll do is we'll leverage those channels to drop shorter clips and highlights and drive people into the platform. Before VIX was here, we had a bunch of websites and apps. Basically, every TV company has digital, right? They have apps and websites. We have those too, and so there are whole teams that build these websites and apps and nurture them and bring people in for page views and sampling. So it's the old adage of like, get people into the sampling process easily and let them find their way into the longer form edition of that. So VIX is really today the longer form edition of that. The time will tell if we can crack some code on maybe some shorter form like content. It's tricky because what you don't want to do is duplicate what you're doing on a YouTube, right? Because otherwise, what's the point? You want to be where people are, and you want people to come somewhere else if it makes sense. So in this case, we've been laser focused, on longer form content. I think our thoughts around shorter form is we're trying to balance the discipline of bringing people here for the reason we know they want to come here, with creating new habits and new engagement models, right? Like if I knew that VIX had something I can consume at a glance while I'm waiting in line at the grocery store, right? I might go there and I might spend that. So we might be able to buy some time spent in that way, in that dimension of short form consumption, if we can deliver on the unique value, the unique content that we have. So we're thinking a lot about that. But by and large, we're thinking it's more about YouTube as our competitor more than any other streamer per se.
Yeah, and as you talk more about expansion, I think about companies like the New York Times and how they were able to expand now into cooking recipes or video games. Netflix is also toying with video games or even fitness programming. So I think different platforms are mastering one format and trying to get into other formats. So curious to know like how you go about preventing your core and keeping that identity that makes you unique, while also testing the ground, knowing that your stakes are very high, right? Like when you run an experiment, it's not about getting a few more users. We're talking about the next 100 million users.
That's right. And I think we're still in that kind of table stakes mode. So while it's very tempting to think about things like, in-stream shopping, betting, watch parties, all of those kinds of things, because we do this a reality show. It's sort of a Big Brother like thing called La Casa de los Famosos, and it runs for like several weeks at a time, 24/7. You put a bunch of celebrities into a house, and what happens? And people come in at all hours of the day and night to watch this thing, and you can't help but wonder, would some people want to watch that together, right? And is there some co-consumption? Is there some Twitch-like model there, right, that might make sense? And so we have to balance, do we spend this quarter leading up to the next La Casa de los Famosos on hardening the platform so that we can handle the volume and the quality of experience is good? Or do we start dabbling into the Twitch-like watch party, segments? It's tempting, but I try to prioritize every quarter. We sort of reprioritize and reorder what we're prioritizing. But what tends to happen is platform performance always remains number one, because you don't have anything else without that, right? People don't have any patience. So we've been performant through things like La Casa, through things like we did the World Cup. And at the time we had just launched. 6 months later, we had done the World Cup, where we had like 3 million concurrent viewers. And what's different here is I'm in charge of product, but I'm also in charge of engineering, which is kind of a pattern you see at media companies. They used to have them as separate roles. And I think with just the changes and the way things are, they sort of they combine them when they can, right? And so in my case, when I took the job, I took both of those responsibilities as well as design and operations. So it's all one. The beauty of that is I can harmonize those functions, and they're less of a matrix because everybody's kind of one family and they all take care of each other. So we can rally behind things like that. And performance and scale is kind of one of those paramount things that we can never take our eye off of and take for granted.
That's such a good reminder that sometimes the next big thing is doing what you do, but better.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And in the dividends that you can, right, that you can see by doing that, right? And we just are in the process of updating all of our video players, and are because especially on mobile, we're about to launch mobile downloads for the first time in the next month. And we needed some enhancements to our player. In the quality improvements we're able to make with our player, guess what? We're starting to see the total streaming hours go up and to the right? And it's like, what's different? Oh, we put a new player in that's more performant. It's very basic, but it turns out when works,
yeah,
people use it.
Totally. Less flashy maybe than launching a new category or app, but ultimately it's driving the success that you're looking for. And just to wrap up this conversation, Michael, I want to repeat one of your hot takes here. You said product managers are too utopian. Can you elaborate more on that, please?
Okay, well, to be clear, I don't think every product manager is too utopian, but it's a tendency. It's a tendency of a lot of product managers, and I've seen it over and over again. And it kind of goes like this, in the pure form of product management, in the discipline, in the craft of it, right? We all have these first principles, right? We all have these rules that we've accumulated from whether it's over time in the years on things you've built, or if you're newer into the craft, maybe you've gone to one of your classes, your courses, right? All of these things are happening. And maybe you're newer to it, but you start to acquire this knowledge base of what it means to do this the right way. And in its purest form, you say, okay, what's the outcome we're looking for? Okay, what are the 3 things we might do to get to that outcome? Okay, now it's time to write a product brief. What am I going to build over what period of time that's aligned with that strategy and drives that outcome? Well, given I've done product in different companies now, in tech companies, in my own startups that I've started, in big media companies, in big banks. I've seen it all these different ways, right? And what happens is, if you're doing product in a pure tech company, you got a better shot of living that utopian dream, right? You're going to get more of that there than anywhere else. Because guess what? Those pure play tech companies, they're not thinking of draft on impacts across ecosystems and audiences so much because they're technology companies. And you saw that with social media. You're seeing it again with Gen AI, by the way. It's another inflection of that challenge. If you go to a media company, you don't have the luxury of thinking about it all that way. Because what happens is there's a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot of people you got to get buy-in from. You got to bring people along. You got to go along with them. You got to find some places in the middle. You got budgets that are going to be tighter than they are in tech companies, oftentimes, especially now. There's different constraints. So earlier I talked about the band and the constraints about being in 1988. It's very similar to that. It's like, okay, you only have so much to spend. Whereas like in Disney Plus, I think when I was there, probably had thousands of engineers. I have 250 engineers. Can't think about the world the same way I did then, right? It's a very different set of constraints. So you're not going to have personalization overnight, for example. So if I would have woken up and said, I wanted to launch it personalized and nail that cold start problem at the jump, no way was that going to be possible. I would have been too utopian. I wouldn't have had time to launch all the different distribution partnerships that we had to launch, or launch on all the different TVs that we had to launch, right? I would have had time to do all those things. So I think I've learned the hard way that wherever I go, I can bring the stuff, the grit, the product stuff, but I got to apply it differently, depending on what the company is, who's there, what their background and experience is. A lot of times, I know my boss here, a lot of times he came from Viacom. So he was used to, product and tech being like this service center where he was the client. That's a very different dynamic than what you're going to be as a product manager at Meta, right? If you're the product manager at Meta and you're launching a feature and you need the distribution team to launch some partnerships, you enlist them. They're working for you on this thing. Or if you need some product marketing, no, they're coming to work for you, right? So the tables kind of turn, and you have to be willing to play it with those dynamics, which is why I say, like, a lot of times people that worked with me in tech companies, they both wouldn't have the patience, the nerve, or the interest to do it at a media company, right? It's a different set of things. And I see, it's funny. I tell different product managers that work for me now, I'm like, look, the good news is, yes, you got those constraints, but the trade-off is you get to work in this with some of the best content that so many people in the world want to see every day, right? You don't get that every day in a tech company.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful to do a real deep dive into how you're building product for a media company. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. It's great to see you.